And with that, I hope you all enjoy today's session on managing remote and virtual teams. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our featured presenter today. He is Executive Leadership Coach and Professional Development Consultant, Mr. Brian Ackles. Brian, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Kelly, for that. That's a wonderful introduction. So let's dive into managing remote and virtual teams, and what a perfect venue it is to do that. I mean, this is how we manage teams is using remote tools like GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar. So a couple of objectives that we're going to get through in the next little while. So we're going to look at some of the areas that are going to be critical to successfully managing remote and virtual teams, and also help you start to build a roadmap to address some of the areas that you may be concerned with about your success as a manager managing remote and virtual team resources and people. So let's start off by looking at what defines remote and virtual teams. But before we jump into that, I'd actually like to get some kind of an idea about what experience we have on the webinar about people working in remote and virtual teams. So Kelly, if you could go ahead and run the first class poll, please. So while you're responding to the poll, one of the things to think about when you're looking at virtual and remote teams is how you actually work. Do you work in an office where you are separated from your colleagues by a number of floors? Are you working on a campus where colleagues might be in a different building on your work campus? Do you work with people in different parts of the country or in different countries around the world? All of these locations can be deemed as part of a virtual and remote team. So how are we doing on those numbers, Kelly?
All right, Brian, we're right around 70% for those that currently work on a virtual team, about
Okay.
10% for those that have worked on a virtual team in the past, and then about 20%, again, these numbers keep changing, for those that have never worked on a virtual or remote team.
Okay, so the vast majority of people then have currently work or have worked on a virtual and remote team. That's excellent. So that's none of this should be terribly new to you. Sorry about that. So what is a team, first of all? And let's go right back to basics. So a team is a group of people who are working together towards some common goal, and each member of the team has to bring something to the work in order for that goal to be achieved. So a virtual team or a remote team is people who work together but who are separated geographically. And as I said before, the geographical separation can be across the campus, even amongst different floors in a building, working from home, working in different parts of the country, different parts of or different countries around the world. It's important to note, though, that home working is not necessarily the same as working on a remote and virtual team. So, for instance, I have the ability in my full-time job to work from home, but that does not mean that I'm working on a remote and virtual team on those days that I choose to remote work from home. There is a subtle difference, and I'll touch on this more as we work through the webinar. So what is different, or what kind of a model do we have for remote and virtual teams? At the foundation level, it's about relationship management. When you're dealing in an office environment where you're working closely with people and you're working with them face to face, the relationship management is relatively straightforward in many ways, because you can see people, you can talk to them face to face, and you have the ability to interact with them at lunch, at coffee breaks, after work, before work, in the gym, whatever. So that's the foundation. And the foundation doesn't change. However, how you support that team does change with virtual and remote teams. So the support is done through email, through phone calls, through instant messaging platform, through potentially quite rare meetings face to face, but meetings which are using virtual presence technology similar to what we're using today. But then, of course, at the top, there's still task management. regardless of whether it's remote and virtual or whether it's a face-to-face, typical co-located team, the bottom line is the work must get done, and the tasks that are assigned to the team that have some common output have to be completed in order for the organization to be successful. So it all wraps around the relationship and the support functions in order to get the tasks done. Now, as a team manager in all of this, your responsibilities are similar to what you're doing in a co-located environment. You have to make sure that people are very clear about what they're responsible for, that authorities are well defined, and that people have to know if they're doing a good job. Now, let's roll back and go through these again, but look at it through the lens of a remote and virtual team. So clarity about what people are responsible for. Because you're not interacting with people all the time, because of the separation inherent in a remote and virtual team, people have to be very clear on what they're responsible for. And that can go so far as writing, agreeing on work contracts, documenting what the responsibilities are, and gaining that agreement and reviewing those responsibilities on a very regular basis. And also because of the aspects of co-locate, or the aspects of remote and virtual team members, what their authority is to act. So there'd be typically a lot more delegated authority for people who are working in a remote and virtual environment. You don't have the opportunity as a manager to spend time authorizing what you might normally do in a co-located environment. So people are delegated and authorized to take more independent decisions. So there's a lot more elements of trust on this. And this comes into the criteria, again, of people doing a good job. What is the criteria to determine if people are doing a good job? So these criteria have to be very, very well defined up front, particularly in this type of environment, because again, they're not getting the face-to-face feedback that they may be getting in a co-located environment, right? Other aspects of management: do our team members' physical, financial, and psychological interests being met? Now, this gets further complicated if you're working with virtual and remote teams who are spread out worldwide, because those needs can be very, very different depending on the country that the person is working in. Okay, so for instance, even the financial requirements for work would be different working in North America as opposed to working in China, working in India. It's not that there are different, how can I put this? It's not that there are different financial levels, but how money is used and how people view remuneration and review their support or view their support is different in different countries. All of this needs to be managed by the team manager. And the last and the bottom line of this in terms of managing remote teams and qualities of the manager is building that sense of identity. So again, when you're working co-located with a team of people, it's relatively easy to build a sense of team cohesiveness and identity. You're working together, you see each other, you can do common social things. Well, if you're working with people that you may never see or may very rarely see, then it's a lot more difficult to build that shared sense of identity. And this is something that remote and virtual team managers really have to struggle with and really have to work hard on. And that's just a lot of communication and a lot of time spent interacting with the team, more so than you would in a co-located environment. So the team management model, then again, similar to what we looked at before, it's about relationship management, communication management, and task management. And arguably, the most important part is in the middle, and it's communication management. Communicating with your team is something that, for those of you that manage remote and virtual teams, you already know this. It's most of your day is spent talking to people on the phone, through messaging platforms, however your organization chooses to communicate. And this is a lot different than managing in a co-located environment. So, we're managing in this environment. We spend our time talking to people. We spend our time on the phone with people. We spend our time also dealing with our own management team to make sure that the organization's views and requirements are being met and that they're being communicated out to our team. And again, it's, you're dealing potentially with time zones which do not align at all, especially if you're working globally. So one of the things to be very cautious and very careful with is looking at the reactive versus proactive style of work. Managing in this remote and virtual environment can be a very highly reactive job. You don't know what's going to be happening on the other side of the world in a given day, and people are going to need information. They're going to be contacting you, or they're going to be making decisions and letting you know about those decisions, which you may then have to react to based on information you got earlier in the day from a corporate source or from another manager's source. So you're reacting a lot to what people are trying, or what people are doing, and how a project may be being executed. The challenge, or the goal of this, if you will, in managing this environment, is trying to find the best ways to becoming more proactive. Now, there's always going to be a reactive element to this, and there's arguably going to be a larger reactive element to working in a virtual team than there will be working in a co-located environment. But the trick is to find a way to minimize that. So start looking at prioritization, reacting to the urgent requirements, the things that absolutely must be done, and then planning on how you're going to act on the important issues, and taking some time to reflect and put together a plan so you're not having to be constantly in a firefighting or reactive mode. So let's go ahead and look at how much time you actually spend reacting to unplanned events today. So Kelly, if you can go ahead. I know that if you're anything like me, it's you have your days planned out. You go to work. You show up. Either show up, which might be going to an office, or staying at home, or going to a remote location. You've got your day planned. You open up your email. You check your email, and all of a sudden, all of your plans have gone out the window because something drastic has happened. Or you get to the end of the day or late in the day, and something goes completely sideways. And typically, at least in my industry, it's primarily Friday afternoons about 3 o'clock when something bad happens and you have to react to it. But that's just the nature of business, I think.
All right, Brian. So we're at about less than 10% for less than 1 hour. Then we have about 70% for 1 to 3 hours, and then about 20% for most of my day.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, those numbers aren't terribly surprising. I'm glad to see it's only 1 to 3 hours. But if you look at 1 to 3 hours on the high side, I keep popping out of this. 3 hours basically gives you almost half your working day if you take in breaks and lunch, etc. So that's a lot of time spent reacting. And for those of you, the 20% of you that we're looking at most of your day, that's a sign that things are very busy for you, and it's a real challenge to work through that type of environment and actually plan to do anything. So I would encourage you to look for ways to find a way to get more proactive planning in your days. So let's go back and start looking at a management model and take a step back and look at some of the key elements that managers need to have when they're setting up to manage a co-located, or managing a remote and virtual team. So a guy by the name of Dr. Henry Mintzberg, who worked out of the University of McGill and now has his own management institute, defined 3 major groupings of roles that managers play when they're working as managers, and their interpersonal roles, their informational roles, and their decisional roles. I won't go into the details of it here, but we'll touch on some of the elements within these 3 major groupings in the next coming up slides. Adapting this model to your virtual team means that you need to expand the focus and definition of who is actually on your team. So what we've been talking about up till now is the people that report to you on your team or report as part of your project lead, etc. So let's look at how we communicate first. So we know that there are tremendous amounts or tremendous abilities now to communicate and share information and collaborate. So if we look at some of the informational roles that Mintzberg talks about, these are roles like the spokesperson or disseminator of information or monitor of information. So there are tools that we're using for this today. SharePoint is used extensively, Dropbox, Google Docs, Google Drive, the whole suite of shared tools. And the challenge is to set these up with your IT department so that they, one, meet the security requirements of your organization, and that people have the ability wherever they're working to access them easily, so that they become true collaboration tools and tools that people are both willing to use and able to use and see a benefit of using. So there is some training elements and training requirements required for this as well. So it's not just making the tools available, but it's also showing people how to use the tools, what the benefits of using the tools are for everybody involved, not just the organization, but for the people actually working on the teams. Another aspect of this is looking at innovation, and this starts getting into the third set of roles that Mintzberg defined, which are the decisional roles, looking at the entrepreneur. One of the big advantages that you get from working with people from a broad spectrum, whether it's around the country or around the world, is you get a lot more potential for innovation, and you get a much broader perspective from your team members, things that we may not think about in North America, but are commonly thought about elsewhere in the world, and vice versa. So this drive, this innovation and this drive for the entrepreneurial spirit is something which should really be encouraged. And this ties back to the authority that you're giving people who are working on a remote and virtual team to resolve issues, to take initiative. So this innovation is something which can be brought back into the team and shared out with everybody that's working on the remote and virtual team. And this is encouraged strongly through the attitudes of the manager in this environment. Now, the other part about this idea of remote and virtual teams is it's not just the people that work for you on the team, but it's also the people that they work with in the environment where they're located. So particularly in geographic separation, you have people working in remote or different divisions who are assigned or tasked to your team. So these people have potentially their own management functions, which they have to report back to for human resources management, etc. They have to deal with that. They have the local political issues within their organizations. So there are stakeholders beyond that you have beyond the people that work for you, and these are stakeholders whom you have to make relations with. Right? These are people you have to get to know. You have to find out what their challenges are, where they're facing pain, so that you understand what the pressures are on the people that are actually working for you in the team. So how does the work that you're doing help these stakeholders, help these different managers in different organizations? Are they going to gain something as a result of the work that's being done, or are they losing the ability to get their work done because their resources have been assigned to your team? And you need to understand that and actually, take that head on, so that people understand that that this person has been assigned to this work because corporate has said that it's very important. I understand that this may cause you some challenges. How can we work together to resolve this? And these are some of the actions and thinking that you have to take. Now, there are also other people working in remote organizations that may have a shared interest in what your team is actually doing. So how do you bring them into the fold, and how do you actually tap into their potential ideas? Although they're not working directly for you, they may be, because they work closely with the person that's on your team, they may be able to feed you information and ideas on how you might better accomplish what you're trying to get done. So again, it's developing relationships, and it's developing these virtual relationships with not only the people that work for you, but also with the people that whom they work with on a day-to-day basis. So based on your stakeholder analysis, and this is something which you should be formally doing, is actually, talking to people, finding out who these people are. Who are the influential people in the organization? Who are the real decision makers? Who are the direct managers, the supervisors? Give these stakeholders information about the project, about the work that's being managed, who you are, what you're responsible for, and how does your responsibility impact them, and how does your responsibility interact with what they're also trying to get done at the local level. So understand what issues they're facing, understand either through direct discussions with them, talking at the corporate level of the organization, reaching out to colleagues that may be working there that aren't involved in your particular team but may be able to give you some insight, and build these relationships, and spend time communicating with these stakeholders, spend time building these relationships, because these relationships will pay huge dividends when something goes sideways and you need to get some extra work done. You can call on these people to help you, and conversely, you may be able to provide support for them. You may have access to resources that they're going to be in really short supply of, and then you can build a relationship that way by helping them out to get some things done that are causing them pain in their local organizations. So it becomes a two-way street. And again, it's about relationship building, and it's about communication. So now let's look at success. How do you know that your team is being successful? Well, the standard measures of success being on time, being on budget, and delivering the quality which is expected by the customer of your product or service. So those are the standard criteria for success. Now, again, if we look at a co-located environment, those numbers and those criteria are understandable and they're at your fingertips. When you're looking at a remote and virtual environment, those criteria can get a little bit harder to define, and you may have to add in some different success criteria. So on time, well, time has a different meaning depending on what culture you're working in, and we'll touch on cultural items before we finish this. So understand what time means. Understand who and where your customer is. If your customer is also globally, or geographically diverse or globally diverse, then understanding what their requirements are for success can be a little bit more complicated. What is the success for your budgets? Is your budget number a hard and fast, we shall not go above this dollar figure regardless of the situation? Well, when dealing in a remote and virtual environment, you have far less control over what's happening at the local level, and some things may happen at the local level which will cost money and cost time to your project and to your effectiveness and to your team. So there has to be an understanding about how you're going to deal with that. So again, it goes back to the stakeholder issue. If you have those good relationships with people and you're working as proactively as you can, then all of this hopefully will give you some information before this becomes a problem. However, you still have to identify this and understand what the real success criteria is. Look at how you're working today. Look at how your people are interacting with the project today, and look for areas of improvement. And again, this ties back to looking for innovation and looking for ideas from the greater team, both from your immediate team members, but also from your sort of broader stakeholder community. How can you improve how you work? How can you improve what you're doing? How can you improve on the work situation? How can you improve on communication? How can you improve on relationship building? How can you improve on building and maintaining a team dynamic and team spirit? Define the success criteria that you need to have for all of this, and more importantly, how you're going to actually measure that criteria. Now, when you're coming up with measurements for success criteria, again, you don't want to overload people with onerous ways of reporting numbers, reporting progress. So it's incumbent on you to, as a manager, to recognize how you want to gather information and making it easy on the people that need to supply you with that information. Now, one other aspect to consider with this is, of course, is how people respond when you're asking for information from them, and this may have a cultural component and a communications component, particularly if you're working with people whose first language is not your first language. So, I mean, I'll make the example is if we're working in an English environment and you're working with people from around the world, English is a common language of business, but for many people, it is not their first language. So gaining the understanding about what you're requesting may take a lot more time, and you may have to adapt that request and adapt those measures to suit the people that you're dealing with that are on your team. So don't presume that they're going to give you information the same way that you would get information from a co-located team that you may be managing in your local environment. And this leads to the last point on this slide, which is looking at the interests, again, of your key stakeholders. So the key stakeholders for your project are, of course, the people that are sponsoring the work that you do, the people who are defining what is going to be successful, your customer, but the key stakeholders are also the people that are on your remote team. So what is the success criteria for the person working on your remote and virtual team? What does it mean for them to be successful? So what does it mean in terms of their career management? How do they see and view their career progression as a result of working on this team? Do they want to move around? Is this something they want to do again? So again, look at the success criteria for your key stakeholders. We talk about success criteria, we talk about remote and virtual teams, and we've mentioned this before, and it's being very conscious of the impact of separation and how people feel when they're not working with people face to face. Co-located teams, relationships are built quickly. If you recall, when you first went into a new job, into a new workplace, you got to know people within the first day, within the first couple of days, within the first week, and you're probably having lunch with the same people that you started having lunch with, during your first week of work. That may not be the case, but you get the idea. Those relationships are easy, much easier to form. In remote and virtual teams, you're not having lunch with people, right? You're not having a casual conversation over coffee. Very likely that your entire team will not ever meet face to face. And this is, again, becoming more and more common with present technologies. They may meet virtually face to face, but again, you still don't get that level of communication context that you get if you're standing in the room with a real three-dimensional person. There is logic and feelings involved in how people work and in the impact of separation of people. And again, this has a cultural component as well. So understanding people's feelings, understanding their opinions, and understanding how those impact relationships is not only something for you as a team manager to be aware of, but it's also something that you need to make sure that your team members are aware of as well in their interactions amongst themselves as a team. That different people work in different ways, and a little bit more care and attention needs to be taken when you're trying to, again, build the context of the team and understand how people are actually working. So in some cultures, it would be horrible to not fulfill your part of the work. Now, it could be horrible in the sense that, if I fail, I've let everybody down, I'm losing face, I'm not doing my job well, and even if I'm sick or if I'm dealing with a horrible family tragedy, I will not let that interfere with my work. Now, of course, you can't help but let that interfere with your work because we're whole people, we're whole beings, and we have feelings and we have emotions. So you have to make it clear to people that they need to let you know what's going on in their personal lives and how that might be affecting their work. Or if you start seeing work outputs changing, you need to take the time to delve into this and try and find out what's going on, and recognizing that over the phone or over a video link, you may not get all the information that you need. So again, building the relationship, building the rapport with people to get to know them very well, so you can deal with the issues that surround people at work. You know, people who are having problems at work, people who are being overstressed at work, people who may be a little bit bored because they don't have enough to do at work. You know, all of these things come into play, and separation just makes this context that much more difficult to deal with. So you have to spend more time doing it. So again, as a remote and virtual team manager, you're spending your time talking to your team a lot more than you may in a co-located environment. So look at perceptions, look at how people view each other. You know, understand that people get stereotyped. People have opinions about other people. People interpret words, interpret language. So if someone may not be the most vibrant English speaker in an environment where, you know, primarily English language business, but they have great technical skills, right? Others can form an opinion that because they can't communicate well in a spoken way, right, that they're not going to do their job well. But we all know that that's not the case. So you have to get past the stereotypes, you have to get past the opinions, and you need to stop people from interpreting things in a negative way. You're always looking for the positive, and you're trying to be aware of the biases that people bring to this. So you need to make efforts to build the bridges between all of your team members in all of your locations, and try and break down those biases and break down those preconceived ideas about people and preconceived stereotypes. And this is, again, part and parcel of what you're doing as a remote and virtual team manager, spending your time to really get to know your people. And it's extraordinarily rewarding. You know, because you're also breaking down your own biases and your own preconceptions and ideas and opinions of people and cultures, because you're dealing with people in a much broader sense, in a much broader environment. One of the things to consider when you're doing all of this is to set up some ground rules. Right? Set up ground rules for how you want to communicate. You know, what is the best communication method? How are you going to manage meetings? What kind of behavior do you want to have in the team? How do you want people to address each other? Do you need to go to a more formal form of address? I'm not suggesting that would be a great idea, but it may have to, depending on the culture. So look at how you want all this up and document these ground rules. And don't create the ground rules and force them on people. Create the ground rules with your team, so that together they're building something that they've decided that how they're going to work, that they then buy into, that they own, and then you can work with them to enforce the ground rules that you have created together. And then test these rules. Like, what would the impact be if something is not being followed? So again, this is part of the discussion you're having with your team when you're setting up these ground rules. Say, how do we correct something if a meeting goes off the rails? How do we actually, you know, do a course correction with that? How do we want to deal with that? And all of this becomes part of what you're discussing and what you're building as a sense of team identity. Provide feedback to your team, provide lots of feedback on their performance, encourage feedback amongst the team members as well, so peer reviews. And you're not doing a quarterly performance management style review session. You're providing feedback on a daily basis or on a weekly basis to people. People need to hear your voice. People need to know that you understand what they're going through. They need to feel that you care about the work that they're doing. Now, you've got to be careful not to turn this into a micromanagement situation. You're asking them how they're doing. And it may be as quick as a short email every day, a quick phone call at a particular time. Hi, it's Bill. I need to, just wanted to check in. How's it going? You got everything you need? Great, fantastic. Listen, if anything comes up, give me a shout, give me a call. Here's you've got my number, right? Or, you know, send me a message, send me an IM, whatever it takes. But that level of feedback is, again, building a very strong link between you and the team, and also amongst the team themselves. You're trying to encourage your team members to communicate across and not just through you. You don't want the communication going up through you and then back down again. You want it to go across as well. Set expectations for people. right? People who work on teams tend to bring, on these virtual and remote teams, tend to bring a higher level of skill and dedication to the roles. It's would not be to your benefit to take a new hire from another organization and put them on to a virtual and remote team, because they don't have the experience in the organization, and they may not have the knowledge about how to work independently and how to work collaboratively at a distance. Now, the performance plans then for these people, individuals that you've got working on your team, need to reflect that higher expectation of their roles on the team, but should also include how they perform in terms of communicating and working with the rest of the team. So it's not just their technical work function that you're looking at in their terms of their performance plans, but it's also their ability to work as part of a team and to function in this remote and virtual environment. Just something to think about as you're setting up performance plans. And then looking at achievements. How do you recognize achievements for people? How do you tell people that they're doing a great job? How do you recognize that somebody's done a wonderful job or just done something great? And again, finding a way to do this which is still culturally appropriate, appropriate to the individual as well. So there's no sense of embarrassment or calling people out for something. But try and make it so that it's understood that when one person succeeds, the team succeeds. So everybody needs to share in that recognition. And that helps, again, to promote the team spirit. Again, one of the cornerstones of what you're trying to do as a remote and virtual team manager is to continually build and maintain the sense of team identity. So again, recognizing achievements also, bottom line, is that it shows that you're actually getting there and that you're actually working towards the goals that the team was set up to achieve. So let's go ahead and run that last poll, Kelly, about how achievements are formally recognized in an organization. So I'm assuming that most of you have had bosses that have said thank you at some point in your lives. I hope so. Anyways, that's will always be nice. It's one of the challenges of organizations is to find a way to recognize achievements without bringing too much I will say familiarity into it. When somebody achieves something, it has to be that recognition needs to be honest and it needs to be appropriate. So, how are we doing?
All right, Brian, we're at about 55% for yes, key achievements are recognized, about 40% for not really, maybe a brief thank you, and about 5% for not at all.
Oh, okay. Well, a very low number for not at all, which is encouraging. Quite a high number for not seeing teams, not seeing achievements really recognized, which is a bit surprising. A brief thank you, maybe, if that's what you're getting. Okay, yeah, that's something which you need to consider and you need to remember as a remote and virtual team manager, to treat people the way that you would like to be treated. So again, to find a way to actually recognize those achievements within the remote and virtual team. All right. So regardless of the situation, we come back to communication. It's always, 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 always going to come back to communications in this. So you're communicating to coordinate work, plan the work, define the objectives, assign responsibilities, manage performance. And again, I can't stress enough, your job is communication. It's spending a whole lot of time on the phone, talking to people, and talking to people when it's convenient for them, not necessarily convenient for you. I have a colleague who just recently took on a job managing a global team of project managers, and when I say global, literally span the globe. And this, great executive director, this person, and she spent a lot of time working from. Well, she spends a lot of time working from 6 in the morning until late into the evening. Now, not continuously, but having to make a phone call at 10:30 at night before she goes to bed, because that's when she needs to get hold of a certain person in a certain country, because that's the best time for them to talk. So again, you're adjusting your work habits and your work day as well, and this is something that you need to be aware of when you take on this responsibility and you take on this quite very rewarding task of managing a virtual and remote team. So again, if you're uncomfortable with communication or you need to improve on your communication, there are a lot of ways to do it. One of the last things we're going to start talking about here is the technology trap. Technology is at best an enabler of communications. And we saw what happened last week when technology fails. And it happens, as Kelly, mentioned at the beginning of this, we rely on external communications platforms. And every once in a while, they just don't work. And do we have plans on how to manage around that when something doesn't work the way that we need it to work? Understand that technology is not a substitute for communication. You can't rely on this. So you've got to look at the limits and understand the limits of technology when you're communicating with people. Understand that you're losing something with reduced bandwidth. So video conferencing, yeah, it's a lot better. You get a lot more clarity. We're moving into high definition video conferencing, which is still two-dimensional. Voice technology, you miss the visual cues. You can't see the fact that I'm waving my hands around while I'm talking to you on a webinar, right? Trust me, I'm waving my hands around. But you can't see that, so you don't know what I'm gesturing and how I'm doing this. I can't stop doing it, whether I'm live or not. So we look at communication channels, and this little graphic gives you an understanding about what the limitations are. So email has very narrow bandwidth. It's very effective to portray formal information. As we move up the scale, the bandwidth requirements are much higher, right? And the effectiveness of the communication also increases drastically. The best way to communicate with people happens to be face-to-face, working together at a whiteboard. So you get a group of people standing around together, trying to solve a problem, standing up at a whiteboard to do this. Now, we've all experienced this at one point where we're working as a group and we'll get something done, and if you get a great result. But as you move down that pyramid, you get less bandwidth, it's less effective. As I said, understand what the technology should be used for. So you choose the right technology. Video for team meetings, audio conference for meetings which require much less bandwidth, just the catch up, telephones one-on-one for brief conversations, email and instant messaging to exchange information. Cost is no longer an issue with this. A number of years ago, you used to think about video conferencing as something which happened in one particular suite dedicated in an organization. Now, with the bandwidth that we have available at our desktops, anybody can do this. I encourage you to think about the communications you use and also choose appropriately. So the last thing I'm going to touch on again is culture, because this is something which can trip up and cause huge problems if it's not managed appropriately. Cultural differences affect how we communicate, our work habits, and our management style. So how we communicate, is it formal or informal? Should it be more formal, depending on the culture that you're working with? Can you joke with people, or does it have to be quite serious and quite straight? How is that relationship built up? And you have to understand these cultural nuances with the people that you're working with and the people that you're managing. So you need to be aware of the cultural elements of each of your team, and also educate your team on the cultural issues which may arise before they become a problem, right? Just because people may have known each other or seen each other or potentially worked with each other in the past in a different environment, don't presume that they're going to understand this in the current environment that you're setting up. So again, it's about communication, and it's about understanding and sharing how people should be working together and understanding the impact of culture on your remote and virtual teams. This is a great and wonderful environment for people to work in, and it's a very satisfying environment for people to work in. And it's, as a manager managing in this type of environment, it's extraordinarily rewarding. It's a lot of work, but it's extraordinarily rewarding because you get to deal with and interact with a much wider cross-section of people. All right, understand the generalities, avoid stereotyping. Remember that diversity exists within every culture, so not everybody is going to be the same. I'm Canadian. We're not all that nice. Some of us are, though. I like to think I am. On that note, I'll end this webinar. I hope that I've given you some food for thought and some information that you can take away with you. And I'll leave it now with Kelly.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Brian. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And thank you, everyone, for coming back this week and joining us for today's rescheduled session. We really appreciate that. If you guys have any questions, Brian and I will stay on the line for the next few minutes so that he can answer those for you. So make sure you get those questions down. Also, just a reminder that today's session is being recorded. So I will send you all a recording link later today for you to review anything you may have missed, or you can pass on to any colleagues who were unable to join us. You can also visit our website at newhorizons.com, click on the webinars link, and there's a full schedule of upcoming sessions that we have that are free for you to attend. So take advantage of those. There you will also find our archive webinar link to view any past session recordings. So you're able to download, there's over 40 webinar recordings, I think, in there. So take advantage of that library and go there. You can also visit our Center for Leadership and Development. So go to newhorizons.com and just click on the Center for Leadership and Development, and you will see a full schedule and list of courses that we have to offer, including managing remote and virtual teams. Just click on the schedule link and you'll see that there with our upcoming sessions. This is normally a 2-day course. So for more information on that, once again, just visit newhorizons.com. Okay, Brian, we do have one question here. Let me see real quick. Okay, given virtual team management is, oh, sorry. They're all coming in right now, so just give me 1 second. Okay, given virtual team management is more complex and requires so much communication, how many virtual teams would you recommend one manages at any given time?
One. The easy answer is one. If you're managing virtual projects, it depends on the complexity of the project. A large program of work or a large project, you're probably only able to deal with one major project or one major team undertaking at a time. If you're dealing with smaller projects which are less complex, then the number grows to what a personal manager's ability to communicate and manage communications is. So if in a co-located environment, if you could manage, say, 4 concurrent projects, because you've got your people working with you directly, that number may scale by 50%. It may have in a virtual environment, because you've got to spend that much more time communicating and coordinating. And again, that's also driven by geographic requirements and time zone requirements, etc.
Okay, this next question is in regards to, they said, you mentioned that new hires don't do well on a virtual team. How should I onboard new hires to get them into my team, onto my virtual team?
So as people gain experience, new hires, and okay, so I'll say new hires that are new graduates would take a lot longer to onboard because they need to be trained on how to work within the organization. New hires that are coming in with experience, that's more of a cultural acclimatization to the organization, and that's working with them to get them up to speed on your work practices, your work requirements, your reporting requirements, etc. So that can be a lot quicker than if you're dealing with a new grad. A new grad is somebody, it's not going to be typically that easy to get them onto a virtual team until they've got some solid work experience under their belt. So that might take a matter of a year or 2 years. But with a new hire, with experience, it could be as quick as a month or so, just to give them the formal training on how the organization works, make sure they understand all the administrative details, etc.
Okay, great. And what are some of the best practices in addressing team members who are hard to reach when you know, especially when you know it's likely intentional?
So if people are intentionally shirking your communication, that becomes a performance management issue, and that's, these people have to understand, and this is part of setting up the ground rules. So best practices is when you're setting up the ground rules to identify, that your expectation is and the team's expectation is that communications will happen in this way. We all agree to it, and if it's not happened, then what are the impact? What are the implications of breaking the ground rules? So we talked a little bit about that, and if they're working, if you've got a team member that's not communicating well and they work remotely in a sister organization or a sister division, then they're going to have direct management. You can reach out to their managers and talk to them. But again, it comes back setting up the ground rules at the beginning and setting up the consequences and the implications of breaking those ground rules.
All right, and here's another great question along those lines too. What are some of the things you can ask in an interview to help determine if someone is a good candidate for a remote team?
Ooh, that's tricky. That's tricky. Good candidate for a remote team is somebody that can demonstrate that they can work independently and that they can work with minimal supervision. So a good question to ask in an interview might be, can you give me an example of a situation where you've had to work on your own with minimal supervision, but still contribute to the outputs of a team, and what are some of the things that you had to do to communicate with that team?
All right, it looks like that is it for questions for today. So
Excellent.
I think we could go ahead and end today's session. So thank you again, Brian. Really appreciate you joining us for these webinars.
An absolute pleasure.
All right. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Once again, you'll hear from me later today with the link to download the session recording at any time you wish. Thanks again, everyone. You may now log off. Have a great day.